Good evening. My name is Joseph Sippets for St. Joseph County Public Library, and I am recording this at 11:47 p.m. on a Saturday. It is time for our story time Saturday adult story time. Today I'm going to be reading from The World of Lore, Monstrous Creatures, which is comes from the podcast people, and the author is Aaron Mahnke. And I'm reading a chapter that is called The Bloody Pit. Okay. Most people are afraid of the dark, and while this is something that we expect from our children, adults hold on to that fear just as tightly. We simply don't talk about it anymore, but it's there, lurking in the back of our minds. Science calls it nyctophobia, the fear of the dark. Since the dawn of humanity, our ancestors have stared into the blackness of caves, tunnels, and basements with the feeling of rot and panic in our bellies. H.P. Lovecraft, the patriarch of the horror genre, published in an essay in 1927 called Supernatural Horror in Literature, and it opens with this profoundly simple statement. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown. People fear the unknown, the what if, and things that they cannot see. We're afraid of our frailness and weakness might be laid bare in the presence of whatever it is that lurks in the shadows. We're afraid of opening up places that should remain closed, and sometimes that's for a good reason. The Berkshire Mountains, which extend north to south across the western sides of Massachusetts and Connecticut, are not the Rockies by any stretch of the imagination. But in 1851, those hills were in someone's way. The Troy and Greenfield Railroad Company wanted to lay some track that would cut through the mountains in the northwest corner of Massachusetts, and so they began to work on a tunnel. On the western end sat the town of Florida, with North Adams holding up on the east end. Between those towns was a solid 5 miles of rock. This building project was no small undertaking, no matter how unimpressive the mountains might be. It ultimately took work crews 24 years to wrap things up and had a total cost of $21.2 million. That's $406.5 million in today's dollars. Monetary costs aside, however, construction of the tunnel came with an even heavier price tag. At least 200 men lost their lives cutting the hole through the bones of the earth. One of the first major tragedies occurred on March 20th, 1865. A team of explosive experts entered the tunnel to plant a charge. The 3 men, Brinkman, Nash, and Kelly — Kelly's first name was Ringo, by the way — and they did their work, and then they ran back down the tunnel to their safety bunker. Only Kelly made it to safety, however. It turns out that he set off the explosion a bit too early, burying the other 2 men alive. Naturally, Kelly felt horrible about it, but no one expected him to go missing, which he did just a short while later for Ringo. The accidents didn't end there, though. The shaft. Building a railroad tunnel through a mountain is complex, and one of the features most tunnels have is a vent shaft. Constant coal-powered train traffic could result in a lot of smoke and fumes, so engineers thought it would be a good idea to have a ventilation shaft that would extend to the surface above and allow the fumes and groundwater to be pumped out. This shaft would be roughly 35 feet in diameter and would eventually stretch more than 1,000 feet down and connect with the train tunnel below. By October 1867, however, it was only 500 feet deep. Essentially, it was a really, really deep hole in the ground. To dig this hole, they constructed a small building at the top, which was used to house a hoist that would get the debris out, as well as a pump system to remove groundwater. Then they lowered a dozen or more Cornish miners into the hole and set them to work. On October 17th, a leaky lantern filled the hoist house with naphtha, an explosive natural gas, and the place blew sky high. As a result, things fell down the shaft. What sorts of things? Well, for starters, 300 freshly sharpened drill bits, then the hoist mechanism itself, and then finally the burning wreckage of the building. All of it fell 5 stories down the tunnel and onto the 13 miners working at the bottom. And because the water pump was destroyed in the explosion, the shaft began to flood. The workers on the surface tried to reach the men at the bottom but failed. One man was lowered into the shaft in a basket, and he was pulled back up when the fumes became unbearable. He managed to gasp the words, "No hope," to the workers around him before slipping into unconsciousness. In the end, they gave up, called it a loss, and covered the shaft. But in the weeks that followed, the workers frequently reported hearing the anguished voices of men crying out in pain. They said they saw the lost Cornish miners carrying picks and shovels, only to watch them vanish moments later. Even the people in the village nearby told tales of odd shapes and muffled cries near the covered pit. Highly educated people, upon visiting the construction site, recorded similar experiences. Glenn Drowan, a correspondent for a local newspaper, wrote, "The ghostly apparitions would appear briefly, then vanish, leaving no footprints in the snow, giving no answers to the miners' calls. Voices, lights, visions in odd shapes, and all in the darkness. All the sorts of experiences we fear might happen to us when we step into the dark bedroom or basement." A full year after the accident, they reopened the shaft and drained out several hundred feet of water that accumulated. They wanted to get back to work, and when they did, they discovered something horrific: the bodies and a raft. Apparently, some of the men had survived the falling drill bits and the debris long enough to manage to build a raft. No one knows how long they stayed alive, but it's clear they died because they had been abandoned in a flooding hole in the ground. After that, the workers began to call the shaft by another name: the Bloody Pit. About 4 years after the gas explosion, 2 men visited the tunnel. One was James McKinstry, a drilling operations superintendent, and the other was Dr. Clifford Owens. While in the tunnel, the 2 men, both educated and respected among their peers, had an encounter that was beyond unusual. Owens wrote, quote, "On the night of June 25, 1872, James McKinstry and I entered the great excavation at precisely 12:30 p.m. We had traveled about 2 full miles into the shaft when we finally halted to rest. Except for the dim, murky, or smoky light cast by our lamps, the place was cold and dark as a tomb. James and I stood there talking for a minute or two and were about to turn back when suddenly I heard a strange, mournful sound. It was just as if someone or something was suffering great pain. The next thing I saw was a dim light coming along the tunnel from a westerly direction. At first I believed this was probably a workman with a lantern. Yet, as the light grew closer, it took on a strange blue color and appeared to change shape, almost into the form of a human being without a head. The light seemed to be floating about a foot or 2 above the tunnel floor. In the next instant, it felt as if the temperature had suddenly dropped and a cold, icy chill ran up and down my spine. The headless form came so close I could have reached out and touched it, but I was too terrified to move. For what seemed like an eternity, McKinstry and I just stood there gaping at the headless thing. The blue light remained motionless for a few seconds, as if it were actually looking us over, then floated off toward the east end of the shaft and vanished into the thin air. I am above all a realist, nor am I prone to repeating gossip and wild tales that defy a reasonable explanation. However, in all truth, I cannot deny what James McKinstry and I witnessed with our own eyes." End quote. The Hosek Tunnel played host to countless other spooky stories over the years that followed. In 1874, a local hunter named Frank Webster vanished when a search party found him stumbling on the banks of the Deerfield River 3 days later. He was without his rifle and appeared to have been beaten bloody. He claimed that he had been ordered into the tunnel by lights and voices, and once he was inside, he saw ghostly figures that floated and wandered about in the dark. His experience ended when something unseen reached out, took his rifle from him, and clubbed him with it. He had no memory of walking out of that tunnel. In 1936, a railroad employee named Joe Imco claimed that he was warned of danger in the tunnel by a mysterious voice, not once, but twice. I'm thinking it was Ringo. Just think it was Ringo. Yeah, in 1973, for some unknown and god-awful reason, a man decided to walk through the full length of the tunnel. This brilliant man, Bernard Hustba, was never seen again. One man who walked through and did make it out, though, claims that while he was in the tunnel, he saw the figure of a man dressed in the old clothing of a 19th century miner. He left in a hurry, from what I would have read. Stories about the tunnel persist to this day. It's common for teams of paranormal investigators to walk the length of the tunnel, although still active, and a dozen or so freight trains pass through there each day. There are rumors of a secret room or many rooms deep inside the tunnel. There's an old monitoring station built into the rock about halfway in, though few have been brave enough to venture all the way there and see it. Those who have report of more of the same unexplained sounds and lights. And remember Ringo Kelly, the sloppy demolition expert who got his 2 co-workers killed in 1865? Well, he showed up again in March of 1866, a full year after the explosion. His body was found 2 miles inside the tunnel in the same exact spot where Brinkman and Nash had died. He had been strangled to death. Good night.